Off-grid and off the radar, a family disappeared without a trace in 1996, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. Their remote cabin stood silent for a decade until nature's cleanup crew, Maggots, revealed secrets that had been buried beneath layers of mystery and time. What investigators found would finally answer the question that had haunted a community for 10 years. What really happened to the family that vanished? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In the summer of 1996, the Johnson family vanished without a trace from their remote cabin nestled high in Washington's Okanagan Highlands. Mary Johnson, a biology teacher with a methodical mind, her husband, Robert Johnson, and their 11-year-old son, Michael, had built a life away from the noise of civilization. Their disappearance left no ripples in the small town of Tonasket. No one saw them pack up. No one witnessed their departure. The townspeople barely knew them. The Johnsons emerged from their forested sanctuary only for necessities, polite but distant during their infrequent supply runs. Locals recalled Mary's quiet smile that never quite reached her eyes, and Robert's perpetually wary gaze that scanned the general store as if expecting trouble from the shelves of canned goods. Michael rarely accompanied them, and when he did, he stayed silent, sketching spiral patterns in a worn notebook. They kept to themselves, said the owner of the local establishment, paid in cash, never lingered for small talk. Robert always seemed on edge. The alarm was raised when Forest Ranger Thomas Wilson conducted a routine fire hazard inspection in the area. What he found chilled him to the bone. The cabin stood perfectly intact, as if the family had simply evaporated mid-morning. Fresh homemade bread sat on the wooden table, the knife beside it clean and waiting. A kettle rested on the cold stove, water inside untouched. 3 pairs of hiking boots, their only footwear, were conspicuously missing from the porch, where they were typically lined up. It was like they stepped out for a walk and never returned. Wilson later reported, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, just emptiness. The authorities combed the dense woodlands surrounding the property for weeks. Search parties called out for the missing family until their voices grew hoarse. Rescue dogs sniffed the perimeter, but lost the scent at the tree line, as if the forest itself had swallowed the Johnsons whole. The most disturbing evidence came from inside the cabin. Michael's bedroom walls were covered with elaborate chalk drawings, intricate spirals that seemed to pull the eye inward, jagged towers reaching toward a colorless sky, and repeated sketches of what appeared to be a massive, gnarled tree. Beneath one particularly detailed drawing, the boy had carefully printed the words, "The Listening Tree," in childish block letters. Sheriff Davis, then a young deputy, photographed every inch of those walls, disturbed by the feverish quality of the artwork. Something wasn't right about those drawings, she confided years later. No 11-year-old draws like that. It was like he was trying to work something out or warn us about something. The Tonasket County Sheriff's Department mobilized every available deputy to search for the Johnson family. For 3 weeks, search parties combed through the dense Okanagan Highlands, calling out for Mary, Robert, and young Michael. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors chopping through the heavy silence of the forest. Tracking dogs lost the scent at the edge of the property, circling in confusion, as if the family had simply vanished into thin air. Sheriff Sarah Davis, then a young deputy with fierce determination in her eyes, led many of the search parties herself. "It's like they walked off the edge of the world," she told reporters, her voice betraying the frustration that would haunt her for years to come. The townspeople of Tonasket had their own theories. In hushed conversations at the local diner, elderly residents spoke of the Loop, a peculiar valley deep in the highlands where hikers reported paths that doubled back on themselves impossibly. Some claimed to have walked for hours, only to end up exactly where they started, despite moving in a straight line. Others whispered about old Salish legends, of forests that listened and remembered, of trees that held the voices of those who passed beneath their branches. "My grandfather wouldn't go near that part of the woods," explained one longtime resident, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Said the trees had ears and the ground had a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. As months stretched into years, the Johnson case file gathered dust. The cabin remained untouched, preserved like a museum exhibit to a mystery no one could solve. Robert's sister Lena visited once, standing silently on the porch for nearly an hour before leaving without entering. She couldn't bring herself to step inside, later telling a friend that she felt watched by something that wasn't human. A decade passed. The cabin became something of a local legend, a place teenagers dared each other to approach but rarely did. Hikers occasionally reported strange experiences near the property, faint footsteps following them through the underbrush, the sensation of being watched, or glimpsing movement at the edge of their vision that vanished when they turned to look. One backpacker from Seattle swore he heard a child's laughter coming from inside the cabin at dusk, though the doors and windows remained sealed. Another claimed to have seen a woman who matched Mary Johnson's description standing motionless among the trees, but when he called out, she disappeared between one blink and the next. No one ever stayed past sunset. Something about the way darkness fell around the Johnson property made even the most rational visitors quicken their pace and look over their shoulders as they left. The cabin stood as a monument to unanswered questions, waiting in patient silence as the forest kept its secrets. The summer of 2006 brought unprecedented storms to the Okanogan Highlands. Rain lashed against the abandoned Johnson cabin for 3 straight days before the mountainside finally gave way. The mudslide tore through the forest with frightening force, uprooting ancient cedars and carving new paths through the wilderness that surrounded Tonasket. 2 hikers, Emma Reeves and Jason Tanner, were traversing a trail nearly half a mile from the property when the putrid smell hit them. At first, they assumed it was a dead animal, but as they followed the nauseating odor, they noticed something more disturbing: hundreds of maggots squirming through freshly exposed soil near the Johnson place. "I've never seen anything like it," Jason later told Sheriff Sarah Davis. "It was as if the ground itself was rotting." The mudslide had torn away part of the cabin's foundation, revealing what appeared to be a concealed entrance. A crude wooden door, reinforced with metal bands and multiple locks, now hung askew from a single hinge. The swarm of writhing white larvae seemed to pour from the darkness beyond. Emma reached for her cell phone with trembling hands. "Something's wrong here," she whispered as she dialed emergency services. "This isn't natural." When authorities arrived, Sheriff Davis was among them, her retirement temporarily forgotten as she stared at the exposed cellar beneath the cabin where the Johnson family had vanished a decade earlier. The seasoned law enforcement officer's face remained impassive, but those who knew her noticed how her hands shook as she pulled on latex gloves. The team descended cautiously into the darkness. Flashlight beams revealed a small, meticulously constructed chamber that shouldn't have existed according to the original cabin plans. The walls were covered with symbols, spirals and jagged lines that matched Michael's childhood drawings. Mirrors hung at odd angles, their surfaces clouded with age. In the center of the room sat 4 objects, arranged with deliberate precision: a mason jar containing dozens of faded Polaroid photographs, a child's wooden recorder, the name Michael crudely etched into its surface, now green with mold, a plastic lunchbox decorated with faded cartoon characters, filled to the brim with small yellowed teeth, far too many for one child. And most disturbing of all, a handwritten note from Mary Johnson, carefully preserved in waxed cloth. Sheriff Davis unfolded it with trembling fingers, reading aloud the 7 words that would haunt the investigation for years to come. "We opened the door too early. Michael is not alone anymore. As the team cataloged the grim discovery, no one noticed the roots that had begun to penetrate the cellar walls, thin tendrils reaching inward from the direction of what locals had come to call the listening tree. The disturbing contents of the cellar ignited a media frenzy across Washington state. News vans lined the dirt roads of Tonasket, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal flowers. Among those drawn to the mystery was Lena Johnson, who recognized her brother's name in the headlines with a sickening jolt of recognition. Lena had spent 15 years organizing other people's histories as an archivist at the Seattle Historical Society, meticulously preserving fragments of strangers' lives while her own family ties withered. When Robert cut contact after marrying Mary, she had respected his wishes, never pushing for reconciliation. Now, that decision haunted her every waking moment. "I should have tried harder," she whispered to Sheriff Davis over coffee at the local diner. The retired officer's weathered face remained impassive as Lena volunteered to catalog the recovered items. "I know how to handle fragile materials. Maybe I'll find something others missed." The sheriff nodded slowly. "The evidence needs someone who cares about more than sensationalism." Miles Smith arrived 3 days later, his pickup truck kicking up dust as it rumbled into town. The journalist had built a modest reputation documenting families who vanished into America's wilderness, choosing isolation over modern society. His website featured dozens of interviews with off-gridders. But the Johnson case represented something different, something potentially career-defining. 3 people don't just evaporate, Miles told Lena during their first meeting at the sheriff's office. His recorder sat between them, red light blinking steadily. "Every disappearance leaves traces. We just need to read them correctly." Lena studied the man across from her. His flannel shirt and practical boots suggested someone comfortable in the wilderness. But his eyes revealed a hungry intelligence that made her simultaneously hopeful and wary. "My brother wasn't the type to leave clues," she replied, fingers tracing the edge of Michael's lunchbox. "He valued privacy above everything." "Everyone leaves something behind," Miles insisted, "even if they don't intend to." Together, they established a makeshift workspace in the town's small library. Lena approached each item with professional care: cotton gloves, acid-free folders, meticulous documentation. Miles brought a different perspective, connecting the Johnson case to broader patterns of rural disappearances and local folklore. What began as an uneasy partnership gradually evolved into something more collaborative. Lena provided context for Robert's behaviors, recognizing his handwriting in the margins of books found in the cabin. The journalist offered theories that, while sometimes far-fetched, forced her to consider possibilities beyond the rational explanations she preferred. Neither spoke about how the case was changing them. How Lena started keeping her shoes by the bed at night. How Miles found himself drawing spirals in his notebook margins without conscious thought. They were being pulled into the mystery, not just documenting it, but becoming part of its unfolding story. Sheriff Sarah Davis had been 42 when the Johnsons vanished, a deputy with something to prove in a department dominated by men who'd known these mountains for generations. Now, a decade later, her hair had silvered and retirement had softened her edges, but the discovery of that cellar had ignited something fierce in her weathered face. "I never filed this," she admitted to Lena Johnson as they stood outside the cabin, rain misting around them. Sarah pulled a plastic evidence bag from her jacket. Inside was a small wooden recorder, its surface darkened with age and soil. "I found it 3 miles east of here, under a cedar, about 2 weeks after they disappeared." The sheriff's calloused fingers traced the etched name, Michael. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I convinced myself he'd come back for it, that returning it to the woods was, I don't know, leaving a breadcrumb trail home." Lena took the bag, her archivist's hands trembling slightly. "You kept this secret for 10 years? "I kept a lot of things secret," Sarah replied, her gaze fixed on the cabin's weathered door. "Like how I sometimes heard music out here, notes that shouldn't carry through these trees." Meanwhile, At Tonnisket's small county office, Dr. Jennifer Brown spread Michael's drawings across a conference table. The child psychologist had analyzed hundreds of troubled children's artwork throughout her career, but something about these spirals and jagged towers made her skin prickle. "The consistency is remarkable," she explained to Miles Smith, who recorded her observations for his research. "Most children develop their artistic patterns over time, but these spirals appear fully formed in his earliest drawings." Jennifer pointed to a series of sketches dated months apart. "See how the spiral always turns 7 times? And this figure, the listening tree, it's anatomically impossible. The roots form a pattern that resembles neural pathways more than actual tree roots." The psychologist had come to Tonnisket expecting a straightforward analysis, childhood trauma manifesting through repetitive imagery. Instead, she found herself staying late at the office, comparing Michael's drawings to ancient symbols and feeling increasingly uneasy about the mathematical precision in an 11-year-old's scrawls. "There's something else," she told Miles, pulling out a magnifying glass. "In every drawing of the tree, there are tiny faces hidden in the bark. Always 7, always watching." She hesitated. "And they're not all children's faces." That night, Jennifer dreamed of spirals turning beneath her feet and woke to find she'd drawn perfect circles on her hotel notepad, though she had no memory of picking up a pen. Lena Johnson sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by photocopies of her sister-in-law's journal. The archivist in her had meticulously organized the entries by date, but the sister in her felt sick with each page she turned. "Something watches us from the trees," Mary had written 3 months before the disappearance. "I told myself it was just deer, or maybe a curious bear, but bears don't stand in the same spot night after night." The biology teacher's early entries were measured and analytical. Observations about local flora, Michael's development, seasonal changes. But by spring, her handwriting had grown jagged, the margins filled with hasty sketches of eyes peering from between tree trunks. "Michael spoke again last night," read an entry from April. "Not English, not any language I recognize. Robert says it's just gibberish, but there's a pattern to it. The same sounds, the same rhythm. When I asked Michael about it this morning, he had no memory of speaking at all." Lena reached for her coffee, noticing her hand trembled slightly. The scientific mind she'd always admired in Mary seemed to war with maternal instinct as the entries progressed. "I'm sleeping in Michael's room now. Whatever calls to him in his sleep has to go through me first." Robert's journal was entirely different. Where Mary documented, Robert spiraled. His entries, tucked into a separate leather-bound notebook, became increasingly fragmented and paranoid. "Need to finish the root structure," he'd scrawled repeatedly. "The mirrors must align with the northern cedar. The locks won't hold without the correct sequence." Lena frowned, remembering her brother's carpentry skills, how he'd always been good with his hands, building tree houses when they were children. But this obsession with a root structure beneath the cabin seemed delusional. "Mary doesn't understand," Robert had written. "The door was always there. I just made it accessible. If we can control it, study it, we'll be safe." Michael sees it too. He's drawn to it every night, his little footprints in the dust leading straight to the cellar door. The final entries chilled Lena to the bone. Robert's handwriting had deteriorated to nearly illegible scribbles about locks that kept turning themselves, mirrors that reflected things that weren't there, and a door they should never have opened. "Michael knows its name now," read the last entry. "I hear him whispering to it through the floorboards. Mary wants to leave, but it's too late for that. The tree is listening. It always has been." Lena closed the journal, feeling the weight of her brother's descent into madness, or something far worse. She reached for her phone to call Miles. Someone needed to hear this. Lena Johnson spread the Polaroids across the cabin's worn kitchen table. her archivist's fingers trembling slightly. Each photograph told a chapter in the family's descent. The earliest images showed Mary's warm smile as she tended her small garden, Robert's strong arms around his wife, and Michael's carefree laughter by the creek. "The timeline is clear," she whispered to Miles, who leaned in with intense focus. "Something changed them." The journalist nodded, carefully arranging the photos in chronological order. As the months progressed, the visual evidence became disturbing. Mary's once bright eyes grew hollow, her biology teacher's curiosity replaced by naked fear. Robert's face transformed too, his cheeks sinking inward, dark circles forming beneath watchful eyes that seemed to stare beyond the camera. "Look at Michael in these later shots," Miles pointed, his voice dropping. The boy's face was consistently distorted, either blurred by motion or, more unsettlingly, deliberately scratched out with what appeared to be a fingernail. Sheriff Davis picked up one particularly troubling photograph. "I remember interviewing the neighbors. Every single one swore the Johnsons only had one child. Yet there it was, undeniable, a silhouette of another child-sized figure standing in the background, partially hidden behind Michael. The shape was too distinct to be a shadow, too solid to be a smudge on the lens. "Who took these pictures?" Dr. Brown asked, studying the composition with professional detachment that barely masked her unease. "Most have Robert's fingerprints," the sheriff replied. "But these last few—" She hesitated. "The angles suggest they were taken by Michael himself." Miles carefully extracted a photograph from the bottom of the pile. It showed Michael standing before an enormous cedar tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, like arthritic fingers. The tree's massive roots visibly broke the soil surface, creating spiral patterns that disappeared beneath the cabin's foundation. "The listening tree," Lena read aloud, from the caption scrawled in shaky handwriting on the back. She recognized her brother's penmanship, but it lacked his usual precision, as if written by a hand that trembled with exhaustion or fear. Dr. Brown compared the root patterns to Michael's drawings. "The spirals match perfectly," she observed. "But look at his expression in this photo." The boy wasn't smiling or frightened. His face showed something far more disturbing, a serene acceptance, his hand outstretched toward the trunk, as if greeting an old friend. "The neighbors mentioned Michael spent hours by this tree," Sheriff Davis said quietly. "I thought it was just a child finding solace in nature." Lena turned the photo over again, noticing additional words faded into the corner. "It knows our names now." Dr. Jennifer Brown sat hunched over her desk, surrounded by photocopies of Michael's spiral drawings. Her analytical mind couldn't reconcile what she was seeing. The intricate patterns matched ancient petroglyphs discovered near Mount Mazama in Oregon, over 400 miles away. These symbols had been carved by an unidentified tribe that vanished without explanation around 8,000 years ago. "This shouldn't be possible," she whispered to herself, tracing the identical curves with her fingertip. The child psychologist had spent weeks comparing the drawings, measuring angles and proportions. The similarities weren't coincidental. They were exact replicas, down to the peculiar notches that interrupted each spiral. Jennifer compiled her findings into a comprehensive paper titled Transgenerational Memory Patterns in Isolated Communities. She submitted it to the Journal of Child Psychology with trembling hands, certain she'd discovered something revolutionary. The response came 3 weeks later: rejection. Her peers called her work speculative, unscientific, and worst of all, fantasy masquerading as research. They didn't even look at the evidence, she told Miles during a phone call, her voice cracking with frustration. The journalist offered sympathetic words, but Jennifer could hear the doubt in his voice too. Everyone wanted answers about the Johnson case, but not ones that challenged their understanding of reality. Meanwhile, Lena Johnson made a discovery of her own while cataloging the items from the hidden cellar. Inside the plastic lunchbox that had contained the small teeth, she found a sealed envelope she'd initially overlooked. The archivist carefully steamed it open, preserving the fragile paper inside. What emerged was a child's drawing, rendered with unusual precision for someone Michael's age. It depicted an enormous tree with a mouth-like hollow in its trunk. The roots spread beneath a small square, presumably the cabin, curling upward like grasping fingers, trying to break through the floor. The image was disturbing enough, but the words written beneath it, in Michael's careful handwriting, sent ice through Lena's veins. "She says I belong to the ground now." "She?" Lena whispered, studying the image. Who was the child referring to? Mary? Or something else entirely? That night, Lena called Sheriff Davis to share her finding. The retired law enforcement officer listened in silence before asking, "Did you notice anything unusual about the drawing itself?" "What do you mean?" Lena asked. "The ink," Sarah replied quietly. "Check if it's actually ink." When Lena examined the drawing under her magnifying glass the next morning, she realized with horror that Michael hadn't used a pen or pencil. The lines were composed of tiny, precise dots, like the trail of something that had burrowed through the paper itself. The weight of a decade-old secret had become unbearable for Sarah Davis. The retired sheriff sat across from Lena Johnson at the small diner in Tonasket, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. Rain tapped against the windows, providing a gentle rhythm to her confession. "I never told anyone this," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient chatter. "During the initial search for your brother's family, I saw Michael." Lena's breath caught. The archivist leaned forward, her professional composure momentarily shattered. He was just standing there, beneath this massive dead cedar tree, completely still, like he was listening to something. Sarah's eyes grew distant. When I called his name, he turned and smiled at me. Not a normal child's smile. Then he just disappeared, between the roots into the ground. I blinked and he was gone. "Why didn't you report this?" Lena demanded, her voice breaking. "Who would believe me? That a child melted into the earth?" Sarah shook her head. "I searched for hours afterward. Nothing. Just silence. I've carried this every day since." Lena reached across the table and squeezed the older woman's hand. The revelation connected too many dots in her meticulous research. Michael's drawings of the listening tree, Mary's journal entries about her son being called by something in the forest. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, Miles Smith was conducting his own investigation. The journalist had convinced himself that spending a night alone in the Johnson cabin would provide the authentic perspective his story needed. He'd set up recording equipment throughout the structure, determined to capture something, anything, that might explain what happened to the family. He fell asleep sometime after midnight, the recorder running beside his sleeping bag on the cabin floor. When Miles awoke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the dusty windows. He felt oddly refreshed, despite the unsettling dreams of spiral patterns and whispering voices. Stretching, he reached for his recording device and rewound the tape to review the night's audio. Most of it contained only the expected sounds: his own breathing, the occasional creak of the old cabin settling, wind in the trees outside. But at exactly 3:17 in the morning, a voice, clear and unmistakable, whispered his full name: Miles Alexander Smith. The journalist played it back 4 times, his hands trembling. He'd told no one his middle name. The property had been secured. He'd been completely alone. Yet someone or something had spoken directly to him in the darkness, knowing exactly who he was. The forensic lab's report arrived on a Tuesday morning, landing on Lena Johnson's desk with the weight of a tombstone. She opened the manila envelope with trembling fingers, already sensing the horror it contained. The DNA analysis of the teeth found in Michael's plastic lunchbox confirmed what everyone had feared, but no one dared articulate. They belonged to 3 different children, none of them her nephew. "These don't match any missing persons cases in Washington," Sheriff Davis said, her weathered face tight with concern. The retired law enforcement officer leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as if physically holding herself together. "Not in the last 30 years, at least." Lena stared at the report, her archivist's mind desperately trying to catalog this information in a way that made sense. "So what are you saying? That Robert and Mary were—" "I'm not saying anything," Sarah interrupted, though her eyes betrayed her thoughts. "But that cellar wasn't built for storing preserves." Miles Smith arrived later that afternoon, his recorder already running as he burst through the door. The journalist's obsession with the case had only intensified since the discovery of the cellar. "Did you see the soil analysis?" he asked without preamble, spreading papers across Lena's kitchen table. "The university found non-native insect species, ones that shouldn't survive in this climate, and fungi that don't match anything in their database." The photographs showed soil samples teeming with pale, writhing organisms and fungal networks that glowed faintly under ultraviolet light. Dr. Jennifer Brown had added her own notes in the margins, her once precise handwriting now jagged with urgency. "The root system beneath the cabin is expanding," Miles continued, pointing to time-lapse images. "It's grown 17 inches in 3 months. The botanist says it's impossible. Trees don't grow like that, especially not in that soil composition." Lena thought of her brother's journal entries about finishing the root structure. Had Robert known what was happening beneath their home? Had he encouraged it? Sheriff Davis picked up one of the photographs, squinting at the image of roots that seemed to pulse with unnatural vitality. "The ground around the listening tree is warm to the touch," she said quietly. "Even in winter. Always has been." That night, after Miles and Sarah had gone, Lena sat alone with Mary's journal, reading her sister-in-law's final entries. The biology teacher's scientific observations had given way to frantic scribbles about movement beneath the floorboards, about Michael sleepwalking toward the cellar door night after night. "The earth is changing," Mary had written. "Or perhaps it's always been this way, and we're only now noticing." Outside Lena's window, the wind carried the distant scent of decay and renewal. The forest breathing, remembering, waiting for the next name to echo through its soil. The search for answers took a terrifying turn when David Miller, a 36-year-old local hiker, vanished during a weekend trek near the Johnson property. Search parties combed the dense forest for 3 days before finding him huddled against the listening tree, clutching Michael's wooden recorder in a white-knuckled grip. Sheriff Sarah Davis was first on the scene, her weathered face paling at the sight of the instrument she'd once returned to the forest. The hiker's eyes were vacant, his clothes soaked through despite the dry weather. When the sheriff asked how he'd found the recorder, David simply shook his head, tears streaming down his dirt-smudged face. "I heard someone playing," he whispered at the hospital later. "A child's voice called my name from underground. I followed it down and down." The man's fingers traced spiral patterns on his blanket as he spoke. "The roots moved. They showed me where to dig." Dr. Jennifer Brown interviewed David 3 times that week. The psychologist's scientific detachment crumbled as she recognized patterns in his ramblings that matched Michael's drawings. When David described dreams of spiral staircases made of roots, she felt her professional composure slipping away. "The voice knew things about me," he told her during their final session. "Things nobody could know." The hiker's hands trembled as he sketched the same spiral pattern that had haunted the Johnson boys' artwork. Jennifer found herself unable to sleep that night. In her darkened bedroom, she stared at her hands until dawn, horrified to discover she could see spiral patterns in her own fingerprints, whirls and loops she'd never noticed in 20 years of professional work. The next day, the psychologist drove to a coffee shop in Penobscot rather than her usual office. As she stirred her drink, the ripples formed perfect concentric circles that transformed into a spiral. When she looked up, the grain in the wooden table seemed to swirl before her eyes. Jennifer called Miles Smith that afternoon, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. The journalist listened intently as she described seeing spirals everywhere, in tree rings outside her window, in the floorboards of her office, even in the steam rising from her morning shower. "I'm losing my mind," she confessed, "or I'm seeing something that's been there all along." Miles remained silent for a long moment before responding. "The recorder," he finally said. "Did anyone test it for DNA besides Michael's?" The question hung between them, unanswered, as Jennifer watched a fly trace a perfect spiral pattern across her kitchen counter. Lena Johnson spent sleepless nights at the county archives, her fingers dusty from handling decades-old property records. What she discovered sent chills down her spine. The cabin her brother Robert had claimed to build himself had actually stood in those woods since 1932, abandoned after its original owners vanished during a harsh winter. "He lied to Mary," Lena whispered to Miles Smith as they examined the faded blueprints. "The original structure never had a cellar. Robert added it himself." The archivist traced the property's history through yellowed documents, finding that 3 previous families had lived there briefly before leaving under mysterious circumstances. None had stayed longer than 2 years. Most troubling was a newspaper clipping from 1948 mentioning a child who went missing near the property, never to be found. "Mary would never have agreed to live there if she'd known," Lena said, her voice breaking. "She trusted him completely." Miles nodded, scribbling notes for his podcast. The journalist had developed dark circles under his eyes since beginning his investigation, his normally meticulous appearance growing disheveled with each passing day. "But why build a cellar?" he asked. "And why hide its existence from his wife?" Back in Penobscot, whispers about the Johnson family had never truly died. Sheriff Davis arranged a meeting with Eleanor Whitman, an 86-year-old woman who had lived in the area her entire life. The elderly resident sat on her porch, hands trembling slightly as she poured tea. "I saw the boy that summer," Eleanor said, her roomy eyes distant with memory, walking alone on Ridgeline Trail about 2 weeks before anyone reported them missing. Davis leaned forward. "Michael, you're certain it was him?" "It looked like him," the woman replied hesitantly, "but something wasn't right. He seemed taller, older somehow. His posture was all wrong, too stiff, like he wasn't comfortable in his own skin." Eleanor set down her teacup with a clatter. "His eyes were what bothered me most. Too dark, too knowing for a child of 11. When I called out to him, he just stared at me, then smiled in a way that made my blood run cold." The sheriff made notes, her pen pressing hard against the paper. "Did you tell anyone about this at the time? Who would believe an old woman?" Eleanor whispered. "Besides, the forest has always kept its secrets. My grandmother used to say some trees remember everything they've ever seen." Later that evening, Davis called Lena with the disturbing account. The archivist listened in silence, connecting this new piece to the puzzle of her brother's deception and the mysterious cellar he'd built beneath a cabin with a history darker than anyone had imagined. Miles Smith couldn't sleep anymore without tasting soil on his tongue. The spirals haunted his dreams, wrapping around his consciousness like roots seeking water. After weeks of obsessive research, he channeled his growing fixation into The Listening Woods, a podcast that chronicled the Johnson family mystery. What began as a niche investigation exploded overnight, reaching hundreds of thousands of listeners across the country. "I've never seen anything like it," he told Lena Johnson over coffee at Penobscot's only diner. "People are sending recordings, photographs, journal entries, all with connections to the loop." His eyes were bloodshot, his fingers constantly drumming against his coffee mug. A woman from Oregon claims her grandfather disappeared in these woods in 1952. A hiker found a child's shoe with spirals carved into the sole. The podcast became a phenomenon, with listeners forming online communities to analyze evidence and share theories. Some traveled to Okanagan Highlands, leaving offerings at the base of cedar trees. Local businesses thrived on the sudden tourism, selling T-shirts with spiral designs and wooden recorders like Michael's. Meanwhile, Dr. Jennifer Brown watched her professional reputation crumble. Her paper suggesting Michael's drawings represented intergenerational memory echoing, patterns passed through bloodlines or absorbed from the environment, was met with derision from the academic community. "They're calling me the ghost whisperer now," she confided to Sheriff Davis during a rare moment of vulnerability. The psychologist's office walls were covered with photocopies of Michael's artwork alongside ancient petroglyphs and cave paintings. "But look at these patterns. They're identical to symbols carved by people who lived here 8,000 years ago." The sheriff studied the images, her weathered face betraying nothing. "And what do you think they mean?" Jennifer ran her fingers through her disheveled hair. "I think the forest remembers. I think it speaks through us, through children especially." She pulled out a folder containing drawings from 5 different children who had visited the area over the past century. Each featured the same distinctive spiral pattern. Michael wasn't creating these images, he was receiving them. As Jennifer's professional standing deteriorated, her conviction only strengthened. She began spending nights in her car near the Johnson property, recording the sounds of the forest, convinced she could hear patterns in the rustling leaves, messages encoded in nature itself. "The memory isn't in the people," she told Miles during a podcast interview that would later be downloaded over 1 million times. "It's in the soil, the roots, the very air we breathe here." And whatever remembered Michael Johnson, it's still listening for new names to learn. Lena Johnson's hands trembled as she inserted the weathered cassette into the player. The label, faded but legible, read Day 732 in Mary's neat handwriting. The archivist had cataloged dozens of tapes already, but something about this one made her pulse quicken. She pressed play, adjusting the volume as the machine whirred to life. "It's been 2 years now." Mary's voice emerged, thin and distant. The biology teacher's once confident tone had deteriorated into something fragile. "Robert built the door beneath the floorboards. He said it would keep us safe, but he lied." A long pause followed, punctuated by what sounded like branches scraping against glass. "Michael opened it last week. My beautiful boy. He said the tree was calling him. Now I'm the one who must feed it." Static overwhelmed the recording, Mary's final words dissolving into electronic noise. As Lena reached to stop the tape, she felt a subtle vibration beneath her feet. The floor seemed to shift, just slightly, as if something far below was stirring. She yanked her hand away from the player, heart hammering against her ribs. Miles called from the doorway, his voice breaking her trance. "Found anything?" the journalist asked, notebook in hand. "Nothing conclusive," Lena lied, uncertain why she felt compelled to keep Mary's confession private. The weight of her brother's secrets pressed down on her shoulders. Across town, Sheriff Sarah Davis sat at her kitchen table, pen hovering over cream-colored stationery. The retired law enforcement officer had postponed this task for years, but the discovery of the cellar had forced her hand. Her granddaughter's 12th birthday approached, the same age Michael had been when he vanished. "My dearest Emma," she wrote, the words flowing more easily than expected. "There are things about our forests that no one speaks of aloud." Sarah detailed her encounter with the Johnson boy, how his smile had seemed too wide when she spotted him beneath that massive cedar. How he'd vanished between one blink and the next, leaving only disturbed soil and the faint scent of decay. "Never sleep near cedar trees," she warned, underlining the sentence twice. They remember your name. Sarah sealed the letter, knowing her daughter would call it superstition if she discovered it. But the sheriff couldn't shake the memory of Michael's eyes, how they'd reflected nothing. Not even light, or the certainty that something in those woods had marked her the moment she called his name. She touched the small spiral birthmark on her wrist, the one that had appeared days after the Johnsons disappeared. It seemed darker lately, more defined, like a signature slowly being completed. The environmental assessment team arrived at the Johnson property on a frigid December morning, their breath forming clouds in the air. Jennifer Brown accompanied them, clutching her notebook as she watched the technicians set up their equipment around the massive cedar known as the listening tree. What they discovered defied natural explanation. "The thermal readings make no sense," muttered the lead scientist, adjusting his instruments. "It's 28 degrees out here, but the air surrounding this tree is hovering at 72. The warmth created a perfect microclimate, a bubble of perpetual summer around the twisted trunk." Jennifer placed her palm against the bark, feeling an unsettling pulse beneath her fingertips. The tree wasn't just warm, it seemed to breathe. She quickly withdrew her hand, noticing how the roots disappeared into the soil in perfect spirals, just like Michael's drawings. Back at the cabin, Sheriff Sarah Davis supervised the latest cleanup effort. Every summer since the cellar's discovery, maggots appeared in writhing masses near the foundation. The county had tried everything: chemical treatments, soil replacement, even burning the affected areas. Nothing worked. "They always come back," Sarah told Lena Johnson, who had returned to document the phenomenon. "Same spot, same pattern, almost like they're being called." Lena photographed the infestation, noticing how the larvae formed distinct spiral patterns in the dirt. She couldn't help but think of her nephew's artwork, the same swirling motifs that had covered his bedroom walls. Inside the cabin, the contrast was stark. While the listening tree radiated unnatural heat, the cabin walls remained ice-cold regardless of the season. Miles Smith ran his recorder along the floorboards, capturing the strange vibrations that resonated through the wood. "It's like a heartbeat," the journalist whispered, pressing his ear to the floor. "Listen." The thrumming came at irregular intervals, not mechanical, but organic. Something beneath the cabin was alive. The environmental team's final report only deepened the mystery. Soil samples revealed foreign enzymes that shouldn't exist in Washington's ecosystem. The maggots themselves were genetically unusual, a hybrid species that entomologists couldn't classify. "Whatever's happening here isn't just about the Johnson family anymore," Miles told Lena as they stood at the property's edge. "It's spreading." That night, as the team packed their equipment, one of the technicians noticed something disturbing. The roots of the listening tree had extended 3 feet since morning, reaching toward the cabin's foundation like grasping fingers. When he pointed it out to his colleagues, no one believed him. But the soil around the cabin had shifted, and something waited beneath, patient and hungry. Lena Johnson hunched over her laptop in the dimly lit motel room, her eyes burning from hours of research. The archivist had been meticulously cross-referencing Michael's spiral drawings against ancient symbols when something clicked. She found herself staring at photographs of petroglyphs from caves near Mount Mazama, their spiraling patterns eerily identical to those Michael had drawn as a toddler. "This can't be coincidence," she whispered, pulling out Mary's journal. Flipping through the worn pages, she found entries from when Michael was barely 3 years old. Mary had written about her son's creative doodles, dismissing them as normal childhood art. But now, with the cave images side by side with scans of Michael's drawings, the similarity was undeniable. The archivist's hands trembled as she dialed Miles Smith. "I found something," she said without preamble. "Michael was drawing these patterns before he could properly hold a crayon." Meanwhile, Miles was conducting his own investigation in Tonasket. The journalist sat across from Eleanor White, an 87-year-old Salish woman whose family had lived in the region for generations. Her weathered hands wrapped around a mug of tea as she spoke of the whispers beneath. "My grandmother told me never to answer when the forest calls your name," Eleanor explained, her voice steady despite the chilling nature of her words. "The spirits live in the roots and soil. They remember names, repeat them until someone answers. Once you answer, they know you." Miles leaned forward, his recorder capturing every word. "And what happens when someone answers?" Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the window, toward the distant highlands. "They become part of the whispers." The survivalist journalist pressed further, asking about the listening tree and the Johnson cabin. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "That land has always been hungry," she said. "The legend is older than Tonasket itself. No one remembers how it began, only that it continues." Later that evening, Miles and Lena compared notes over the phone. Mary dismissed the drawings. Lena explained, "But what if they weren't random? What if Michael was trying to communicate something he couldn't understand himself?" "A warning," Miles suggested, thinking of Eleanor's stories. "Or a map," Lena countered. "The spirals always lead inward, toward a central point." The connection was forming between them. Michael's innate knowledge of symbols he couldn't possibly have learned, the ancient petroglyphs, and the whispers that called from beneath the soil. Whatever had happened to the Johnson family, the roots of their disappearance stretched far deeper and further back than anyone had imagined. "We need to go back to the cabin," Miles said finally. Lena closed her eyes, remembering the chill of the floorboards beneath her feet. "I know," she whispered. "It's waiting for us." The forensic team's report landed on Lena Johnson's desk with a dull thud. She flipped through the pages, her archivist's eyes catching details others might miss. Dr. Jennifer Brown stood beside her, arms crossed tightly against her chest, as if warding off a chill. "This changes everything," Lena whispered, tracing the diagrams with her finger. "The cellar wasn't built for preserving food. It was designed to contain something." The analysis revealed a sophisticated structure beneath its crude appearance. The walls were reinforced with unusual materials and lined with symbols that matched fragments of Michael's drawings. Mirrors had been strategically placed at exact angles, creating a complex system of reflected light. Most disturbing were the locks, not meant to keep people out, but to keep something in. "Mary was trying to trap it," Jennifer said, her scientific mind struggling with the implications. "These markings, they're containment symbols from at least 3 different cultural traditions." Sheriff Sarah Davis joined them, her weathered face grave. "I found these," she said, placing a folder of photographs on the table. "Taken the day after we discovered the cellar." The images showed how the roots of the listening tree had penetrated the underground chamber, breaking through concrete and stone with impossible strength. They formed a perfect spiral pattern across the floor and walls, mathematical in its precision. "The roots weren't random," Jennifer observed. "They're following the exact pattern Michael drew years before the tree reached this far." Miles Smith arrived late, recording device in hand. The journalist's eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, his normally meticulous appearance disheveled. "You need to see this," he said, leading them down to the cellar entrance. In the dim light of their flashlights, the spiral of roots glowed with a faint bioluminescence, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. The broken mechanisms Mary had installed lay scattered and useless. Whatever seals she had created had failed long ago. "Robert built it," Lena said, remembering her brother's carpentry skills. "But Mary designed it. She was trying to protect Michael." Sarah nodded slowly. "The question is, from what?" Miles pointed to where the spiral center disappeared into the earth. "Whatever it was, it's been feeding on the secrets buried here, growing stronger." Jennifer knelt beside a root, careful not to touch it. "The tree isn't just alive, it's evolving. These cellular structures shouldn't be possible. Lena thought of Mary's journal entries about Michael being drawn to something beneath the cabin. She remembered the teeth in the lunchbox, the whispered names on the recorder. "My brother knew," she said finally. "He knew what was beneath their home all along." The listening tree continued its silent growth, drawing power from decades of secrets, feeding on the memories trapped in the soil. The autumn chill clung to Lena Johnson's shoulders as she approached the cabin for what she promised herself would be the final time. 10 years of questions, months of investigation, and still, the mystery of her brother's family haunted her every waking moment. The wooden recorder felt unnaturally heavy in her pocket. Michael's recorder, with his name etched in childish letters along its side. "This ends today," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold mountain air. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, the usual birdsong conspicuously absent. The cabin stood as it always had, weathered but oddly preserved. Lena hesitated at the threshold, remembering Miles Smith's warning about spending time alone at the site. The journalist had grown increasingly paranoid after his overnight stay, claiming the walls themselves had whispered to him. But Lena needed closure, needed to say goodbye to the ghosts of Robert, Mary, and her nephew. With trembling fingers, she withdrew the recorder from her pocket. The plastic was worn smooth, discolored from years of handling. Dr. Brown had analyzed it thoroughly, finding nothing but static and the occasional sound of a child's breathing. The psychologist had eventually returned it, her scientific curiosity giving way to uncharacteristic discomfort. "One last time," Lena murmured, pressing the play button with her thumb. Static crackled through the tiny speaker, exactly as expected. She closed her eyes, listening to the white noise that had become so familiar. Then, just as she was about to switch it off, the static cleared. In the final 5 seconds of the recording, a child's voice, unmistakably Michael's, yet somehow older, whispered clearly, "I still remember your name, Aunt Lena." The archivist froze, blood turning to ice in her veins. She hadn't heard her nephew's voice in over a decade, yet she recognized it instantly. The recorder slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the wooden floorboards. As she stood paralyzed in the doorway, the soil beneath her boots shifted, ever so slightly. Like something large moving underground, the forest seemed to inhale, a collective breath that made the cabin walls creak. The air grew thick and oppressive, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The same distinctive smell Sheriff Davis had described from her encounter with Michael years ago. Lena's gaze darted to the corner where the floorboards had once concealed the entrance to the cellar. Though sealed now with concrete and steel, she could swear she heard something scratching beneath. Patient, persistent, waiting. The recorder at her feet continued to play, though she'd never rewound the tape. Static, then silence, then that whisper again. "I still remember your name." Lena Johnson stepped away from the cabin, her boots crunching on fallen pine needles as her heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched Michael's wooden recorder so tightly her knuckles whitened, the name etched into its surface, pressing against her palm like a brand. The meticulous archivist in her wanted to catalog everything she'd discovered, to organize the horror into something comprehensible. But the aunt in her, the woman who had failed her nephew years ago, knew some truths defied organization. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to anymore. The wind carried her words away, swallowing them into the dense forest that had already consumed so many secrets. 50 yards down the path, curiosity overcame her dread. Lena turned for one final look at the place that had stolen her brother's family. The cabin stood silent as ever, its weathered boards gray against the darkening sky. But beyond it, the massive cedar, the listening tree, had transformed. Its gnarled branches, which had been bare just days before, now drooped under the weight of pale, sickly flowers that seemed to glow with an inner light. The blossoms resembled no species the former biology teacher, Mary, would have recognized. Waxy and translucent, with centers that pulsed like tiny hearts. The sight froze Lena in place. Sheriff Davis had warned her about this, the tree's cycle of dormancy and awakening. The retired law enforcement officer had tracked it for years, noting how it bloomed only when new visitors came to investigate the Johnson mystery. A movement near the base of the tree caught her eye. From between two massive roots that curved like protective arms, two small eyes blinked in the shadows. Neither animal nor human, but something between. They fixed on Lena with terrible recognition, and she felt her name being pulled from her mind like a thread being unwound. Miles had experienced this too. The journalist had described the sensation in his final podcast notes, the feeling of being known, remembered, cataloged by something ancient that lived beneath the soil. He disappeared 3 days later, leaving only his recording equipment behind. The eyes blinked again, and Lena thought she saw the outline of a small figure, child-sized, but wrong somehow, its proportions subtly distorted. It raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a beckoning gesture. Lena backed away, understanding with horrible clarity that the cycle her brother had stumbled into wasn't broken. The disappearance of the Johnson family wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A door opened that could never truly close. Whatever lived in the roots of the listening tree was patient, and it remembered names. It had remembered hers. The Johnson family's disappearance evolved from local mystery to modern folklore, whispered around campfires throughout the Pacific Northwest. In Tenaskeet's diners, parents warned children not to wander too deep into the Okanagan Highlands, especially near that abandoned cabin where the earth never quite settled. The story spread through hushed conversations, handwritten journals, and eventually digital platforms that carried the tale far beyond Washington state. Miles Smith's podcast, The Listening Woods, reached over 3 million downloads before its unexpected finale. The last episode featured only static and silence for most of its runtime, until attentive listeners discovered voices buried in the background noise. Audio engineers isolated what sounded like names being called in a rhythmic, unfamiliar language. The recording became the subject of linguistic studies, with experts unable to match it to any known dialect. Miles himself vanished shortly after uploading the episode, his apartment found empty except for a small cedar sapling growing impossibly through his floorboards. Lena Johnson retreated to her archival work in Boston, refusing all interview requests about her brother's family. Those close to her noticed how she flinched at the sound of wind through trees, how she avoided parks and forests entirely. She dedicated her remaining years to cataloging disappearances throughout the Okanagan region dating back to the 19th century, establishing patterns no one had previously connected. Her research remained unpublished at her request, sealed in a university archive with instructions that it remain closed until 50 years after her death. Sheriff Sarah Davis passed away peacefully in her sleep, but her granddaughter reported finding soil in the old woman's bed. Dark, rich earth that shouldn't have been there. Dr. Jennifer Brown abandoned her practice and moved to Arizona, as far from forests as she could manage. Her final academic paper, rejected by every journal, detailed the psychological impact of environmental memory on human consciousness. The cabin itself eventually collapsed during a winter storm, the rotting timbers finally giving way. Forest rangers attempted to clear the site, but equipment mysteriously malfunctioned. The listening tree continued to grow, its twisted trunk now twice as thick, its roots spreading in perfect spirals beneath the forest floor. Every summer, like clockwork, the maggots return, writhing masses that appear overnight, regardless of temperature or conditions. Hikers report hearing children's laughter near the site, though no children are ever found. And each year, on the anniversary of the Johnsons' disappearance, locals swear the forest grows quieter, as if holding its breath, waiting for someone new to speak their name to the trees.